Does a woodworking shop need a 3D printer? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, as I just spent the last 3 weeks building dozens of woodworking accessories for my shop. So come along with me today as we find out whether or not this 3D printer can pay for itself or if it's just going to collect dust. So this isn't my first 3D printer. In fact, it's my second one, and my son inherited my first one and he absolutely loves it. In fact, all of my boys fight over that printer trying to make the latest gadget they find. But it's been a couple of years since I got that printer, so I wanted to see how the technology has progressed. And my original model was only a one filament model, so I wanted to see how these multi-filament models worked. And not only that, I wanted to make some stuff and share my experience with you. And lastly, I was curious as to whether or not this tool could pay for itself after its first couple weeks of use. So let's not waste any more time and dive in to see what I got. This is the FlashForge AD5X. Let's take a closer look. Now this video is not a product review of this printer specifically, as you can make a decision based on your needs. But I will say I was quite pleased with the performance of this model, so if you're in the market for one, this would be one I would recommend. Let me tell you some of my impressions with this printer. So first off, this printer is a very affordable 4-filament printer that costs just $379. So $379 is the amount of money I'll need to recoup if I want to make my money back on my first round of tools, but I'll also need to buy some filament. And this is the first thing I noticed about this 3D printer, as the filament cost was just $25 a spool versus what it used to cost at $40. So we're already off to a good start, but let's talk about the 4 categories of tools that I made with this 3D printer. These categories are storage, measuring and marking, clamping, as well as accessories. So you may be asking, how the heck did I create all these tools that sit in front of me? Did I design them myself? Absolutely not. That's well above my skill level, as I have no experience with design or CAD. You see, there's thousands, maybe even millions of pre-designed tools out there on websites like MakerWorld. All you need to do is to type in what type of tool you're looking for and download the 3MF or the STL file. Then using the wireless connection from your computer to the device, you can begin printing right away. And most of these items take anywhere from 1 to 4 hours to create, so you can go about your day. And that's exactly why this video took me so long to create. So let's go over some of the interesting items I made with this tool. You know, my 3D printer started printing out scary stories in Braille in the middle of the night. Yeah, it's giving me nothing but goosebumps. And since we have over 20 items to take a look at today, we're going to be moving fairly quickly. So let's get into our first category, which is storage. And for each item we take a look at today, I assigned a dollar value to that item based on my research on Amazon. And I'll keep a tally of all the money we saved right up here in the corner. First up, we have some 5-inch orbital sandpaper storage. Now, if you're like me, your sandpaper storage may be a cluttered mess, and it may be very difficult to find the grit you need. But a simple little tray like this can help solve all that. Not only does each tray nest inside each other, but it also has a lid on top to keep the dust out. And this is one of the first projects I made where it was really nice to have a multicolor filament 3D printer. And you'll notice on this sandpaper storage, not only does it have a finger notch to easily remove your sandpaper, but it also has the grits labeled right on the side. And for me, I just chose the trays for the grits that I use the most often, which is about 1/4 of the trays available. The next item I chose to create was something that I could incorporate with my French cleat wall. One of my most lost items in my shop is my tape measure. In fact, I even have a shirt to prove it. This tape measure holder not only has a French cleat on the very back, but it also fits perfectly into my 3/4 inch French cleat wall. And it will fit up to 3 tape measures of a variety of different sizes comfortably, and is a heck of a lot nicer than what I'm currently dealing with. Next up, if you're like me, you're always looking for new clamping storage. Now, I've created some French cleat storage for my parallel clamps, but frankly, I've run out of room. And I even have overflow on my floor, so I thought I'd give this thing a try. If we look at this wall-mounted parallel clamp holder, one of the first things you'll notice is it's expandable. It's that dovetail design that allows you to link these up together so that you can have a complete row of clamps. And you'll also notice right next to those dovetails, there's 4 countersunk mounting holes to easily attach to your wall. So with just a couple of screws, you can get these things mounted to your walls, getting 3 parallel clamps stored away. And that's an item I know I'm going to continue to print out. For our next 3D storage solution, I thought I'd take a trip over to the router table. Router bit storage can always be an issue, especially after you begin to accumulate them over the years. Properly storing those router bits is what this next 3D printed item is perfect for. This 1/4-inch shank router bit holder holds up to 21 router bits, and the spacing of the holes on this system are just about perfect. You could even place some of your larger bits right next to each other. And any system that will store those potentially misplaced or damaged router bits away is a winner in my book. Now for the next two items, I only assigned a $5 value to each item, as you just can't do this without a 3D printer. So let's dive into our first item, which takes care of two of my favorite tools in my shop, and that's the DFM Carpenter Square and the DFM Mini Square. Now if you have these two tools, you know as good as me, you can oftentimes lose the pins that come with these items. And that's precisely why I made this next storage item. This unique device is the perfect storage solution for both of these squares. Simply slide the Mini Square and the Carpenter Square into the slot. Not only does this thing have storage for both of those squares, but there's also a little slot on the side where you can place those pins. And this is the perfect setup to slide right into one of your drawers so that you know where all these pieces are all the time. The final storage solution that I made shows my progression from my previous 3D printer to this FlashForge 85X. And this will be our first example of using multiple color filaments on one piece with this new 3D printer. A couple of years back, with my one filament old 3D printer, I built a setup block holder for all my setup blocks. And I still use this today, but this FlashForge takes it to an entirely different level. Instead of being a blank case for those setup blocks, this FlashForge setup blocks has all the measurements listed right on the side, allowing you to quickly and easily pick out what you need, which is especially important for the smaller blocks which have no markings on them. And that makes this unit just a great way to store all your setup blocks. Well, that's going to take us through our first category of items which I made with this 3D printer, which is storage. Now let's move on to our second category, which is measuring and marking. You know, I finally programmed my 3D printer to print some money. Yeah, I programmed it to make coins, but all it's printing is dollar bills. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, as I made these measuring and marking tools, I encountered more problems in this category than any other category. And I'll discuss some of the problems I had with 3D printing at the end of this video, but let's move on to what I made successfully. Now, we just took a look at storage for setup blocks, but what if we not only made the storage for the setup blocks, but also the setup blocks themselves? Well, that's exactly what I did with our first measuring and marking item, and this is probably one of my favorites. Now, this was actually two files in the same project, one for the setup blocks themselves, and then another one for the case. Now, as you can see, this is a 9-piece setup block set, and all the measurements are clearly labeled on the outside of the case. What I really like about these setup blocks is since I use two colors, they're very easy to read, and they actually have 3 points of reference for that measurement. And each one of these gauges is dead accurate, whether you're using the bottom reference, the top reference, or even the side. And because of all this, this is an incredibly valuable tool that you can make for almost free. The next item I made is a 3D square, which is very similar to a lot of the squares we've taken a look at in this channel. Now, this 3D square does use 3 color filaments and does require a little bit of assembly with some CA glue. But once glued up, you can see it really resembles all those other 3D squares. Not only does this thing have scribe holes, but it also has incremental markings as well as a lip so that you can reference your workpiece. And it's even dead square, as you can see when we compare it to our woodpeckers. Since I was on a square tear, I thought I'd try to print out one of woodpecker's most expensive squares, the Delve square. Now, I wasn't expecting my 3D printer to completely replace my Delve square, but I was quite impressed. Just like the Delve square, it has that tiny lip on the bottom, and it even has markings along the side so that you can set your angle. And lastly, it does have those scribe holes. And really, the only issue I have with this square is that it's a metric, but I guess it's nice to have a metric square in your shop. I tried to find this square in Imperial, but I just couldn't find it. And this can really be an issue with a lot of items you find online, as most of the world is on metric. But it is indeed square when we compare it to the woodpeckers, and I think is a great thing to make with your 3D printer. The next item I made, I had a couple of problems with, but once I found a download that worked, it works great. And that's one thing I've learned from 3D printing. If your first design doesn't work, try to find another maker of that design and see if that works. But you guessed it, I was easily able to create a 1-2-3 block with this machine. And this 3D printed 1-2-3 block is dead accurate. Whether you compare it to the 1, the 2, or even the 3-inch side, it's perfectly matched. You just gotta find the right file that works best with your machine. The next item I dialed up was all about figuring out out what size the metric bolts were in my shop. Instead of fiddling around at the hardware store, this simple device can let you know what you need before you go. Simply slide your bolt into the side of the tool to get your width, in this case an M8, and then place the bolt onto the top of the tool to get the length. In this case, we need a 16mm length. And it's a simple little measuring tool like this that takes all the guesswork out of what you need at the hardware store. So you probably already have a DFM mini square, but what if you could make one with this device? Well, that's exactly what I tried to do when I saw this next item. Now, this is another thing that you kind of have to be aware of when you're looking at 3D print files. Although this tiny square is completely square and it does come with some pins, those pins just won't fit into the slots on this square. Now, this could be resolved with a little bit of sanding. However, the critical piece, which is the center finder on the center of the square, is also melted together, making that function of the square completely inoperable. However, it is nice to have a tiny little square like this. Well, that's going to take us through our second category of measuring and marking, but we're only about halfway through the tools that I made with this 3D printer. Before we move on to our third category, I ask you to do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and share this video. It really does help out this woodworking channel. Also, if you haven't already, check out my website, flynndoggwoodwork.com, where you can get access to all sorts of fun woodworking accessories like all the t-shirts that I wear in my videos. And I've even released some new models of t-shirts. And just like I do with all my videos, I'll leave a link in the description below for the 3D printer that I used on all these projects, as well as any tools we take a look at. And finally, if you'd like to support the channel further, check out my channel memberships where you can get early access to all my videos, as well as one member video a week. Now let's get into our next category. For our next category, I plowed out a bunch of items for clamping. Let's take a look at what I made. Here's one for you. What does a printer and a prostate have in common? They both control pee. So you probably have some of those L-shaped corner clamp brackets in your shop, and these work okay, but when I saw this next item, I thought I'd give it a try. This honestly reminded me of something that woodpeckers might design, but it's a lot cheaper. Not only does this item square up any corners that you need to clamp up, but it also has a lot of different clamping options. With all of its nooks and crannies, you can use a variety of different types of clamps, including clamps like MFT or track clamps, quick clamps, F-style clamps, and even parallel clamps, making this one of the most versatile clamping squares I think I've ever seen, and you can't beat the price of just a few cents. Now for our next item, I had to do a little bit of digging, and I thought to myself, can you build a whole clamp with this 3D printer? Well, surprisingly, the answer is yes. Let's take a look at what I found. Now this is one that I wasn't quite sure was going to work, as I was really concerned about the tolerances with this screw. But surprisingly, as you just saw, that clamping screw opens and closes perfectly right off the printer. And by placing the clamping jaw over the two corner brackets, you can square up and tighten up any corner you're gluing up. And the design of this one still really impresses me, especially for coming off of a 3D printer. Now, a lot of times we're not dealing with butt joints on our corners, and for this reason we need another solution. And this is legitimately an item that I've been wanting to purchase for quite some time, so when I saw you could print it, I knew I had to give it a try. By simply taking each one of these pieces and clamping it onto the side of a mitered corner, you can then take a secondary clamp and tighten that miter up, giving you a tight, clean miter that you may not be able to get with normal corner clamps. And for this reason alone, I think this is a great addition to any shop and something that's excellent to print out on a 3D printer. Since we're diving into corner clamping, this next idea I saw was so simple I knew I had to give it a try, especially if you're like me and have some of those Irwin quick clamps. This clamping accessory simply replaces the pads on those quick clamps. Simply remove both the pads on this clamp and you'll notice that these new clamping jaws have the same T-slot to slide right over the clamp. Then you can slide the new clamping jaws onto that quick grip and you can see exactly how this works. This clamping system quickly squares up those corners and uses a trusted clamp in your shop. And with the ease and functionality of this system, I know this isn't going to be the only pair that I'm going to print out. The next clamping solution that I found is something that's perfect to be used with any clamp that has a bar. Not only does this item help to straighten out some of your panel glue ups, but it also might help to protect some of your clamps. These clamp standoffs are really pretty unique. They have 4 mounting holes on the bottom in case you want to make a clamping station. But if you want something a little less permanent like me, these will also do the trick. Simply slide it over the bar of something like an F-clamp or a parallel clamp. Not only do these standoffs give you a flat surface to support your panel, but if they're placed over the seams of your panel, they can act as cauls. And since these work with almost any style of clamp, I think these are a great addition for any shop. So as you can probably tell, clamping accessories are pretty impressive with a 3D printer, and I just scratched the surface. But we aren't done yet, as we've got got one more category to cover, which is a catch-all, and that's woodworking accessories. You know, my baby's mama asked me to print a copy of the Kama Sutra on my 3D printer. I want to tell her that's just not how these things work, but I'm afraid it's going to put me in an awkward position. And this is really where you can find some pretty cool items, including jigs, which is exactly what our first item is. So this is an item that I think is very well designed. However, when I printed it out, I realized that it's just the wrong size for me. But I did want to show it to you, however, as I think if I get the right size bit for this tool or adjust the holes on this item, I think it will be a valuable tool. This is obviously a shelf pin jig, and one of the first things you probably noticed was that dovetail design, which means this thing is completely expandable. By simply sliding the two pieces into each other, you can make this as long or short as you want. And on the side, it even has a reference lip so that you can slide it up right against your plywood. And as you continue to make your holes, you can even reference your last hole by the two reference pins. And I think with either a new bit, a new file, or an adjustment to this design, this can be a great addition to your shop. Next up is an item that's about as simple as it gets, and it's perfect for cord management. Now, I only printed out one of these, but I intend on printing out a bunch more. All you need to do is to place your cord into the little notch and then place it right over your dust collection hose. And just like that, you have some easy cord management for things like your sander on your dust collection hose. And there's a ton of different versions out there, so depending on what type of tools you use, I'm sure you can find a compatible model. The next item I found I thought was a gimmick until I tried it out, and it might be perfect for somebody with arthritis. Now, at first glance, you may not have any idea of what this item does, but it's meant to be used with your glue bottle no matter what brand you use. We all know that your glue bottles can get gunked up, and for this reason, it can be very difficult to get that cap up. But by placing this item right underneath that cap, it provides just enough leverage to easily pop open that glue bottle. But that's not all this little item can do. As you'll notice, there's a little swinging tab. If we pull that swinging tab out and place the bottle into that notch, it instantly allows gravity to do its work. By holding the bottle upside down like this, it instantly brings all the glue down to the tip, and you no longer have to do that ketchup pound. This is something that I didn't even know I needed, but now that I have it, I'm going to use it all the time. The next item is something that you're going to find tons of variations on, so you're just going to have to pick one. That's right, these are bench dogs, and this is something you're going to want to pay particular attention to as to whether or not you're printing out 3/4 inch bench dogs or 20mm. And the reason I made this set was because of the variety of different types of dogs that came with it, including singular, straight line, and corner. Not to mention they've got a variety of different size thicknesses so that you can use them with different size stock. And I suspect with all the different varieties available, this won't be the last set I print out. The next two items I made have everything to do with your track saw. Something that seems very popular today is creating a cover for your arbor hole. Not only does this potentially improve dust collection, but it also provides a little bit of protection, but this wasn't easy to make. Now, I was trying to make this version of it, but I had a lot of failed attempts, and I tried to make this thing about 3 times. Even with adding supports, I just couldn't get this thing to print, so I quickly shifted to a simpler version. Now, although not as sexy as that other version, it does indeed work. All you do is you pop it into place and you're ready to go. So I guess as they say, sometimes simpler is just a little bit better. But let's try something that's a little bit more complex for the track saw that's meant to be used with the track itself. I've collected a few rail squares over the years. Some are really expensive and some are really cheap, but there's none as cheap as this next one I just made. And this one really surprised me. Just like any other rail square, it slides into the bottom of your track. But the jury was still out. Is this thing actually square? Well, let's test it out. So with the track and rail square in place, I'm going to strike a line on the cutting surface of the track. Now with that line made, I'm going to remove the track, grab my TS32, and see how it compares. And if we look at the head and the end of that woodpecker square, you can see there's no variation in the distance between the square and that line. And with that type of accuracy with a simple printout, I'm completely amazed. But let's check out our last printed item of the day, which is something that every workshop needs to have replaced every once in a while. Now at first glance, you may not realize what this item is, but it's a table saw accessory that you probably already have. But it's actually a little bit more than that. It's a combination push stick as well as push block. Let me show you how this two-function item can be used. The first function of this tool is to be used as a push stick. By simply using the front end of this tool, you can quickly and easily slide your workpiece through your table saw. But if you want more support, you can use the entire bottom of this tool to run your workpiece through. And since this thing has a very comfortable ergonomic grip, it's just as good as any other push stick or push block that I own. And that wraps up all the items I've created with this 3D printer over the last 3 3 weeks, and I even have some more filament left over from all these items. So did this 3D printer pay for itself? Well, I think it's safe to say with all the tools we made from just a little bit of filament, this thing easily pays for itself and then some. But before we wrap up today's video, I did want to touch on some of the issues you may encounter if you're a beginner and you get a 3D printer. One of the first things that may frustrate you as you get into 3D printing is drooping filament. Now, a lot of this can be alleviated by creating supports for your project, but what I've come to find out is this doesn't always work. And this is exactly what happened with that arbor guard that I tried to create for my track saw, as it was so small that I couldn't even create supports for it. Another important thing to consider if you're using a multicolor 3D printer is choosing the correct colors for your project. If we look at the 2 squares I created, you can see that the color choice wasn't exactly perfect, as it's very hard to read some of those markings. It's also very important to not give up on a design if it fails. Since there's usually multiple designs of the same product, if one fails on you, you should try another. And this is exactly what happened to me when I tried to make that 1, 2, 3 block. You also need to be aware that sizing isn't always exactly accurate. This is especially important when working with things like bench dogs. And finally, probably my most important advice is to grab some rubbing alcohol. If you don't clean the plate on your 3D printer regularly, you're going to end up with some designs that are going to stick to that plate. And finally, just realize that some designs just don't work. In fact, 2 of the designs that I was most excited to print out, I tried to print out multiple times and I just couldn't get them to work. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I had a lot of fun showing you some of the potential items you can create with your very own 3D printer. This FlashForge 85X 4-filament printer really is a champ, and I've really just begun to scratch the surface with my 3D printing. If you haven't already, do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and share this video, as it really does help out this woodworking channel. And if you haven't checked out my website, go to flynndogwoodwork.com, where you can see all sorts of fun woodworking accessories like all the t-shirts that I wear in my videos, and I've just released some new models. And just like with all my videos, if any of the tools we've taken a look at, including that 3D printer, interest you, I'll leave links in the description below so that you can go check them out for yourself. And lastly, if you'd like to support the channel even further, check out my channel memberships, where you can get early access to all my videos as well as 1 member video a week. Until next time, take care as always. Yes, sir. Why won't Snoop Dogg spend money on a 3D printer? Well, he'd rather spend it on a 4D. No? Jeez. Let's try this one. You know, it took me forever to upgrade my 2D printer to a 3D one. I figured if I waited long enough, I could get a 34 double D. All right, last try. What do you call a 3D printer that takes up painting? Well, it's the artist formerly known as Prince.